The GovX Show is supported by Forrester, helping government organisations perform at their best. Visit forrester.com to learn more.
Hello again, welcome to another episode of the Government Transformation Podcast. I'm Tim Coulthard, Community Director here at Government Transformation Magazine, and very pleased to welcome today Harry Scott-Trimble, who is the Head of Design at Maytech. We will be exploring the future of public service design and delivery, and also the recent past and the present. How has it changed in the past 18 months to 2 years during the pandemic? How do citizens expect services to be delivered now? How do government organisations, healthcare organisations, local government organisations rethink the way they design and execute services to match the needs of their expectations of their citizens? Loads of ideas percolating around the public sector at the moment. So we wanted to talk to Harry about how he sees things changing, how some of their own projects are evolving with their public sector partners, and what some of the trends for the future might look like. Tons of interesting ideas to get through there. So let's jump right into that conversation now. So, Harry, great to have you join us today on the GovX Show. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. Looking forward to chatting about some of your work and exploring some of the ideas around the sort of the future of government, the relationship between government and citizens. But before we get into that good stuff, just wanted to set the scene a bit. So maybe you could just tell us a bit about you, your background, your role with Maytech, and how you're currently kind of working and engaging with the public sector in the UK.
Sure. So I'm head of design at Maytech. Essentially, we work with the public sector to design and build digital public services technology in a better way. In the past, I guess we've been better known for like software engineering capabilities. That's when we started. But in the kind of last, I guess, like 12 months, we've started looking at things like design. And that's why I've joined and we've grown out our team. If you've used Wi-Fi recently, that's a service that we help build. But as I said, I kind of head up user centered design at Maytech, which is a really exciting place at the moment. So it's a team of designers and researchers. And we're increasingly talking to our customers, so public sector organizations, not just about how we can build software with them, but how we can actually help them understand the needs of their users and actually find better ways they can go and meet those. And we actually kind of want to get to the point where we're helping public sector organizations like achieve targets and outcomes. That might be air quality or school places or local jobs or anything else really. And we actually think by kind of using things like design principles, we can help those organizations reach those outcomes faster and actually try and use a minimum amount of technology, but in a kind of quite targeted way. That's what we're kind of hoping to do. Me personally, I've been working in and around the public sector for probably 8 years now. So I first started working in NHS Trust, kind of the first designer there. The particular service I was working on was dealing with like addiction and gambling. That was a real eye-opener, understanding just kind of how the basics were in place. Then I was really lucky. I went to go and work at Government Digital Service for a couple of years, mostly working on the design system. So if you've used any services that look like GovUK, there's a fair chance myself or the team I used to work with will kind of help on some of that. And then I went to go and work for my friend's startup for a while. We're actually working firstly on health through Google DeepMind and a few other kind of alphabet companies. And then before I came to Maytech, about this time last year, I worked at the British Red Cross, actually working a lot with local government on emergency planning. So a lot of stuff off the back of Grenfell, floods, any other sort of kind of big emergency like natural disasters, and kind of understanding how design and tech can help the planning and logistics of those things to be much better. And now I'm here at Maytech. We've got a much bigger team of designers and researchers since I joined. That's been my job, to put that together. And we're across the UK, which is really exciting as well. You don't necessarily need to be living in London to pursue a career in design, which is really, I think, exciting aspect of public sector design. So our team's kind of distributed across Newcastle, Birmingham, Glasgow, London, Bristol, near to where I live.
Fantastic. Lots of background there. And I think what's interesting is, I suppose, in a way, your career reflects the way that the sort of discipline of design and public services is evolving in some ways, in that it's much less about doing this thing that in a self-contained box. It's much more about this sort of end-to-end process of understanding user needs, building the services, taking the feedback, then pushing that further downstream in terms of frontline activity. And then also that, I suppose, that diversity in terms of short-term crisis services versus that sort of longer term piece around, full life services. When we talk to people like DWP and they say we are cradle to grave engagement in terms of every part of your life is going to interact with us as a department. So there's a huge sort of diversity with a big D and a small d in terms of the way service design is evolving. So I'm looking forward to sort of jumping into some of that stuff, because I think we hear terms sort of bandied around, and to understand from you who's sort of there making this stuff happen, what they really mean in your experience. So things like user-centric design, it's on everybody's lips, but we're going to get into some of that stuff around what good might look like, as opposed to just sort of playing lip service to it. So
sure.
we'll jump into some of that stuff. So I wanted to start with a bit of context, really. You joined us at one of our conferences in November, and it was interesting. We were talking around a theme of sort of changing relationships between citizens and government, citizens and local government, citizens and healthcare, public sector as a whole. And I think there's a sense that it's been partly accelerated by the pandemic. A lot of organizations have said, well, we feel like our relationship's changing with our end users and with our citizens. And I wondered if that's something you're picking up on, obviously working with both end users and government in terms of research. Do you feel that changing relationship is evident? And I guess, how would you characterize it?
So I think accelerated is a great word to use here, because clearly there's a lot of transformation that has been done and still underway. The influence of government digital service, I guess, also is alongside the kind of government having actually a large majority has created a mandate for change, and government departments can commit longer term and more significant transformation programs. So I think accelerator is the right word. So I think there's been kind of, like anything, there's lots of forces that kind of contribute to wider changes. I think there's actually kind of a trickle down from what's been happening in central government in the last 5 to 10 years, from central government to smaller places as well. And I think there's basically an expectation now that smaller organizations should be able to solve their own problems. And it's great to see actually there's a lot of people who've cut their teeth during the early years of GDS and now heading into other parts of central government and local government and the NHS. But while the kind of expectations have risen, there's kind of, I guess, 2 things that haven't really kept place. One is the availability of skills. There simply isn't anywhere near enough designers and engineers and product people able to do the work that organizations need, which is super exciting in some respects, because I remember back in, when I left art school, I wanted to do public sector work, but it just didn't exist as a job. Right. So now we're in the flip side where there simply is enough people with these skills. It's super, super interesting. I guess the second thing is there's churn. So while organizations are getting better at hiring these people, I guess there's still a lot to learn about how to actually keep them and actually have lasting capabilities. But the kind of interesting thing is that the pandemic has actually cleared a lot of permission for teams to normally spend months to have to try and get to just deliver. And hopefully this kind of points to where teams actually spend more time building and less time kind of navigating organizational politics. For example, the virtual visits service we built in partnership with the NHS or some of its trusts, we delivered a working bit of software in 48 hours in the very early stages of the pandemic. And that expectation that things can be spun up and created in a short amount of time, you're actually closing that feedback loop between the kind of urgent needs of the organization and what can be delivered is super, super interesting. It's also worth noting that the virtual visit service is open source, and so any public sector organization is actually welcome to reuse and build on that technology as well. And so I think the expectation, the relationships change, the fact that organizations are expected to be able to change much faster in response to the kind of world around them. And I guess it's really shown that the pandemic, that when there's urgency, technology actually can be applied much more quickly and effectively, whether that's vaccines or, you know, in the kind of world we live in, software.
Yeah.
And so I think that expectations change, that you don't, that these the time from need to meeting that need is actually closing, and it's actually possible to do that.
So it's interesting that there's been this sort of demonstration of the art of the possible, both in terms of, you know, giving partners or internal teams the sort of license to move at pace, and then I guess there's part of it which is also, well, in fact there's probably three parts. There's sort of strategic desire or appetite for risk to now do things faster, which then means empowering teams to move faster. And then the third part of that is the expectation among citizens that, well, I don't ever want to go in an office again if I to get whatever service it is. I want to be able to fill in forms online, or I want to have a portal where I can, you know, self-serve and do a lot of this stuff. So clearly some of that stuff's changing. And do you feel that as we emerge into something resembling normality, that those three streams sort of maintain that commitment, or is there any sort of backtracking towards the old ways, or do you think we've kind of crossed the Rubicon now and no going back?
I mean, I hope it's like it's an onward trend, that people expect the public sector to move as fast as it has in the last 2 years. I mean, I think back, I mean, maybe this might, the fact I was a bit younger and maybe a bit more impatient, I used to get quite frustrated at the speed at which things would happen. So I hope the expectations there, and that I think the public had expectations already, because other sectors around the public sector, you know, be it like banking or retail, were kind of we're on this journey already, and the kind of speed and convenience involved there. But what I hope has changed is that people who, you know, have the responsibility and I guess the pressure to run these public sector organizations see that it's not that risky doing things at pace. And actually, sometimes there's a much bigger risk in not doing anything. So I hope that's proven that you can, you know, take these more modern ways of working and get more done, and actually very often it'd be cheaper as well, because you're, you know, running a small team that can do really agile, effective work, rather than, you know, spending millions of pounds on proprietary software and vendor lock-in and all these other different ineffective things. Yeah.
And in terms of how some of this this new sort of thinking plays out, often the sort of where expectation meets delivery is around what channels are we using, how are we executing, where are we sort of designing new services. And the term and concept that often crops up is around this one around channel shift.
Sure.
Now, I think for me, with my far less knowledgeable stance on this than you know, I get the bit that's around, okay, well, it used to be face-to-face, or now it's digital, or whatever, but surely there's more to it than that. So for you and your colleagues at Maytech, that channel shift piece, why is that emerging? What does it mean to you, and what's the potential for it?
Yeah, so this isn't to undermine the great work that's been done all over the country, but there's a kind of outstanding question about why channel shift hasn't seen the same success in the public sector, say it has in banking and retail. So rather than assuming a digital service better by default, what are the actual problems we're trying to solve? Is it saving money? Is it making life easy for end users? And, you know, if I want to become a childminder, is it actually faster and cheaper for me to do that, or the government to do that, than it was like 10 years ago? And I don't think we've really got the data on that, but arguably not. Like, so while there's been some channel shift, been able to like submit information online, like, has it actually led to those outcomes more quickly? And there's still, and clearly like the size and complexity of government is like a factor here, right? But I think we can achieve much more when we start to actually look at the user needs rather than just like the needs of the organization. And I think channel shift's important, I guess, in some cases, like moving some of the operational cost as well, but I feel like it kind of really misses the opportunity around some of this stuff. So should a user have to know which organizations solve the problem? Do like logins really keep out only fraudsters, or are they actually just preventing millions of people from accessing government services? Do we need to ask people for personal information actually not relevant to using that service? Do we know what, and this is probably the most important one in my opinion, like, do we actually really know what metric we expect to go up and down if the service succeeds? Because that's the bit, right? Like, don't get me wrong, like keeping government service costs down is really, really important. Like, you don't want to spend loads of money on administration. You want to get the outcome you're doing, but like that key bit of like, that big transformation thing, did it even have a tangible and notable effect on people's lives? And if you look at channel shift in other industries, like Amazon, Netflix, Uber Eats, it's easy to look at things, I guess, like superficially and just think about it's just a case of like people are now doing stuff on computer screens. But actually the transformation that's really happened is actually what's happening like on the back end of and that's actually where the real transformation is. And I think sometimes we haven't really done natural channel shift. All we've just done is just moved the front end to a screen. We haven't actually done kind of like moving information around or making it that you can move information between different organizations. Like that for me is kind of something that's a bit missing. And it's not necessarily about budgets and costs. I actually think there's enough money in the public sector to do this stuff. It's about prioritizing the longer term and doing that organizational hard work. And it's like sorting out your data, like I said, and which might result in some short-term inconvenience, like, getting rid of a proprietary case management system. But I think there's a need for public sector organizations to like be smart about how they spend their resources, and as far as possible, collaboration on projects and publish and share code. So we're not like solving the same problem again. So I think channel shift is really important, and a lot of it has happened, but whether it's, to use the childminder example, actually sped up the things that people are trying to do in the first place, I'm not totally sure. Like, has it really saved the kind of money we were hoping to do? I'm not sure. And I think that's because we focus on just moving the communication channel, someone's interacting with government, rather than the actual problem you wanted to solve in the first instance. And that's a culture shift, right? Like, asking people like, what's the metric you want to share? Where often it's easy, it's a human precondition to be like, I've got an idea, rather than like, solve this problem.
It's you make a really good point around, and that sort of cost benefit analysis, and the examples that we reach for in terms of sort of private sector change, but public sector is so different, so much more nuanced. You can see how numbers are quite easy to crunch when you've got, how much does it cost to stand up Netflix? How many movies have been watched? Whatever, versus you change the way a service is delivered, or not just the way it's delivered, but the impact of that service. How do you then put a numerical value on a quality of life improvement for somebody, a vulnerable member of society who's getting the benefit? It's not, it's apples and pears. You're not dealing with like for like. So really interesting point you make around there's a sort of maturing needed in terms of the understanding of the whole ecosystem. Yes, we can look at project costs. Yes, we can look at numbers and use numbers and numbers of people visiting websites. But if the transformational outputs are around quality of life or well-being or factors which traditionally you can't put numerical value onto, then that's a whole different kind of ball game.
Exactly, and it's not the only metric. And I do think sometimes, I remember making this point when I worked at the Red Cross, it's like, we're trying to move some of our communications onto the internet, but like the internet should be your operating model. And I think that's the bit that kind of gets missed a bit sometimes when we draw inspiration from the private sector. It's like, no, the internet is like their back office, like the way they run is like the internet on the back office. Whereas like here we might spend loads on, upgrading a form and putting it online and making it usable and accessible, and all these really important things to do. But then you've still got humans sorting through spreadsheets and passing data across, manually between systems. Like it's not a surprise that hasn't, rendered the kind of transformation you were hoping.
Yeah. I don't know to what degree it goes on, but I know it must be the case that what look like fantastic front ends are just disguising the same old processes, the same old manual interventions in the back end, people printing stuff out, people inputting across into different systems that aren't compatible. All of that bad stuff that's been around for ages, I'm sure still lurks in some corners. Not that we all want to talk about it too much. So I wanted to look at, I guess let's start to maybe look at what good looks like in terms of meaningful change, meaningful new ways of thinking in terms of delivery. Starting to move towards that more holistic view of benefits, that more holistic view of outcomes that really deliver change and really deliver quality of life improvements and that sort of stuff. So are there any examples of sort of new ways of delivering that you've seen out there, or particularly, that you've been working on with your colleagues at Maytech, where you can see that changing relationship between government and citizens happening? You can see whether it's technology enabling it, or whether it's that sort of design thinking you're talking about in terms of the way the services themselves are conceived. Any examples you would draw upon there where people should be looking in terms of learning, maybe better ways of moving ahead?
I think one thing the pandemic and the ongoing technology skills gap has kind of highlighted is the need for services to think in terms of like being like remote first. And so I think that is a really obvious one to do. And the fact you can have like distributed teams, you can have, we've often got projects, we've got someone in Manchester, someone in Bristol, someone in Newcastle, like working on the same thing. And so that opens things up quite a bit. But if I remember to one point in the pandemic, I remember seeing like 3 different services from 3 different NHS providers, all using the same like visual language and like code provided by the central NHS. And this would have been like completely inconceivable like 3 years ago. Like someone could use those different services and not know it wasn't the same organization. And I guess there's been a kind of, and the same examples, there's basically been an increase in teams like solving smaller discrete problems. So that might be like taking stock of PPE or reporting a test result, or in our case, like booking a virtual visit to a hospital. And it's much easier to like build the internet when you build in like smaller chunks. There's not these huge programs of just, need to make this massive thing. Like no one did that during the pandemic. They weren't like, oh, we need to make this huge case management system. They were like, actually, we need to make this small component, which we're going to kind of helps us do this immediate need. And actually it's a hell of a lot easier to like maintain and reuse and build on things like that. If I look to virtual visit, we've opened it up to lots of trusts which are now using it. And I think like that is hopefully a direction of travel, just like have smaller problems basically solved. And it's actually much easier to reuse something. Whereas if you've got this huge case management system that's been, made bespoke to your organization's process, it's not surprised it's not very reusable. Whereas if you have like something like, oh, this thing helps you do stock checks, or this thing helps you pass the test results between 2 labs, like that is much more reusable. And I guess to kind of finish up, like the tools that enable more remote collaboration is getting better every day. And I guess it's just showing that you don't actually have to be in the same room to work with people. There's a couple of other points I was going to make, but I think you might have like another question, I think.
Yeah, so I suppose there's always a sort of bit where we have to kind of calm down and go, okay, we're moving at pace. There's lots of opportunities. There's lots of possibilities through technology. And I know digital teams are very cognizant of this because they get very excited. But the watchword, and your colleague Jim Stamp said it on another podcast we did, which is there's a danger that you forget that you're not the archetypal user of a system, that you don't mold things in your own image, and actually you have to design services and think in a way which is obviously inclusive, so that we don't leave anybody behind, which is a phrase that gets used a lot, but it's a real thing. There's people with different levels of digital capability, different levels of digital access, and so it's not a level playing field. So what are some of those guiding principles that you have to sort of keep front of mind when you're working with colleagues in terms of service design and delivery and execution?
And are we kind of talking that in terms of like making sure no one gets kind of left behind, like you said, and inclusivity? Yeah, so I think the first step is that there's no like one fix to making public services completely inclusive. Making your service digital by default may actually exclude some people who don't have access to computers or don't have English as their first language. And so I guess the first point is educating ourselves about the kinds of barriers that can exist, and that can inadvertently be created even with the best intentions. And I think that goes to your point, like, if you're already doing a well-paid office job to work on public services, like you're already not probably the person that's most kind of reliant on the thing you're building. And that's why user research, we have many user researchers at Maytech in my team. That's why what they do is so powerful. It's a listening exercise. Obviously it has to kind of be preconditioned with the acknowledging you probably don't know everything that these barriers you're putting up. So accessibility is incredibly important, but actually it's not the only barrier in the kind of uptake of public services. Like, it's super, super important, accessibility. I don't want to undermine that as well, but that's just about, not just, but that is about people with disabilities or different or situational access needs accessing something on the internet. But actually, disability isn't the only obstacle. There's also the amount of time people have available, people's access to professional advice, people's fear of getting things wrong. And these factors are very often kind of linked to structural stuff like class and race. So these may sound abstract, but our research has shown that these factors may create like real barriers to digital services. So I guess the new opportunities created by digital mention mean that organizations have never had a real better reason to actually go out and speak to people and understand their lives and the kind of barriers they face. So I think the main principle is just going out there and actually listening to your users. And that probably sounds scary, and you probably don't want to find out stuff. If you're running a public sector organization, there's already a lot on your plate, right? You've got a really resource constrained, you're like, the world's kind of changing all the time. A lot of stuff you have to kind of contend with. So I understand like the trepidation about just going out and finding out more stuff you're perhaps not getting perfectly right. But I think about sometimes the chief exec of Deliveroo, he still goes out and delivers food to customers. And if that's true of a company like Deliveroo, like, why can't it be saying of public sector organizations? And saying that the main guiding principle is going out and speaking to people. There's obviously a follow on from that, like making sure you've got, experts that know about providing service to people who English isn't first language. When I worked at the Red Cross, one of the big service lines is around refugee support. So we have people who, work in translation, understand that people think differently about services depending on what like country you grew up in, like these different things. But the fundamental one is just like accepting accepting that you don't know what barriers you put up, and going out and doing that listening exercise. And if you have user research in your team, that's a really powerful way of doing it. But like that will get you going. But actually, it's something everybody can go out and do, is learn more about their users, and that then becomes the technical things. But like, I think the fundamental start is like acknowledging that there are barriers and that you don't know what they are yet.
Yeah, you can understand, from the psychological perspective of why organizations may be squeamish. It's sort of like, well, do we want to hear the harsh truth about what's going on out there, whether our current service is doing the job? But at the same time, the world and society and individuals have been through so much in the last 2 years. It's like, if you're not going to do it now, you never will. And people, and we accept the fact that there's been so much change recently, that why would a service that was maybe designed 18 months, 2 years ago, it would almost be illogical for it to still be functioning perfectly, given the fact that our work-life balances have changed, the social pressures have changed, economic facts have changed, psychology of individuals has been changing, people have been forced to do more digital stuff. So I suppose if not now, then when, I suppose would be the challenge to the public sector.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also being empathetic of that as well. I think I've worked in places before where I don't think there's been enough empathy for people working in public sector organisations, that there's all these changes they have to contend with, and obviously especially in the last like two years. But because it has changed much, so you're saying like, this is a really good opportunity just to kind of stand back a little bit and say, actually, is our way of delivering stuff the right thing? I actually remember at the Red Cross before the pandemic, it was actually kind of hard to have that conversation. And actually, when the pandemic was happening and things were moving so quickly, I think there was a much more acknowledgement that actually the way we've set up our teams like just isn't the right one to respond, even in weeks, let alone kind of like the days and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think going in with empathy as well, but just is a good opportunity, and everyone's kind of in the headspace. I guess the thing to then balance out with is like, you do get change fatigue. I think just across society, see it in friends and families and colleagues, like there is like change fatigue as well. So I think you've got to, like anybody running teams, right, you've got to try and pick your moment. But this does seem like a good moment to really question how we do stuff, and to it's already on the move, so why not just kind of set the direction?
Yeah, absolutely. So I always like to round things off with a really unfair question, which demands way more knowledge of the future than is reasonable to ask anybody. But I was curious, we're at the start of 2022. are there any sort of areas where you can see, I guess, the future of design, delivery, conception of public services going? Maybe not immediately, but in terms of possibilities for the future, what might you expect to see gaining some traction? Crystal ball time, so do your best.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I think non-fungible tokens and the metaverse are going to transform the way we deliver public service in the future. I'm joking, of course.
Yeah.
So seriously, I think it might not be the most exciting answer, but I think there's actually still an enormous untapped potential in like open source technology. And actually some of the examples I talked about already kind of point to that. And but one of the things that really excites me is about the kind of like the future is that kind of collaboration. And it may be counterintuitive for us being a consultancy, which, you know, we effectively make our money by billing clients for people's time, but actually there's still so much work to be done, and in a way it's the only like viable approach. So actually just like solving problems like once, but doing it in a kind of like size and a way that it's like reusable. And I think we've already seen a taste of that in the pandemic. Like GDS already started to do a little bit of that, and I think that was a little bit more about like platforms, so like software as a service platform, be it like payments and notifications, or probably soon like signing in. But I wonder if there's like going to be more open, like small discrete open source projects that are going to be much more easy to reuse by different organizations. I think to some stuff we're doing at the moment around like housing repairs, you know, we're opening up the code, and actually it's been funded by the Department for Levelling Up and Community and Housing to be reusable. Once we get it working with one council, we're going to get it working with some other council. Like that's what the funding's based on. And I do think that is a kind of like direction of travel. And this is particularly true when like, you know, budgets are so under pressure. I think there's also a bit as well that I kind of touched upon when we spoke back in November about like designing for groups. And I'm actually kind of, well, I'm really interested in like social computing. So how do you make public services usable for groups? Be that like a family, a local business, a school. I think that's super, super interesting. At the minute, we're still kind of in the headset of like, you know, log into your Netflix, you'll see you've got multiple accounts for like, I don't mean that. I mean like generally the public service kind of reflects the social group that you interact with when you go into it. And I think that can change all sorts of things like consent, but also open up services to include more people, because very often if someone is vulnerable or at a vulnerable time in their life, they get someone to do things on their behalf. But public service don't really acknowledge that. They kind of, you always have to be the named person on the bill, or, you know, the person who has the login details to do something on their behalf. And I think that's going to be a change over time, is this idea that as humans, we're not just like individuals interacting with services, and that's the only relationship. We kind of come as a group, and public services will start to kind of not just acknowledge that, but like piggyback on that as a way to actually improve the uptake and usability of services.
Yeah.
So that's my, I don't know if it's a prediction, but I think that's my hope. But I certainly know from the user research we do as well, and speaking to colleagues across government as well, like that's a increasing acknowledgement that like that's how people access public services. So I predict in the next like 5 years, I think there'll be many more services where that's the case.
I think you're right, and you know, there will always be new technologies, but that, you know, it's very rare that the sort of absolute game-changing technology emerges and literally transforms everything that we do. Whereas fundamental change around culture and ethos and collaboration and mindset can be more transformative. We're getting senses of public sector agencies collaborating more, whether that's in terms of sort of strategy, but also in terms of, you know, data sharing and, you know, all that sort of collaborative technical side as well. And I think, you know, yes, there might be a technology. If anyone could ever explain to me what an NFT actually was, then I may take a view on whether it has the chance power to change the world. I think the answer is no, isn't it? But it's good to hear that some of those kind of eternal truths around sharing, collaboration, and sort of, you know, best practice being implemented widely and scaled up are the potential, you know, big gains in the public sector.
And I do think, because I remember when I was at Government Digital Service, like getting on 5 years ago now, when like the first like round of like platforms were coming out, there was a kind of underlying intention that there'd be a much better like data sharing, like, or, I mean, when I say data sharing, I mean like automated data sharing, like between government departments. And I do think with like increasing standards, like the sort of fire standard you have in the NHS, genuine collaboration and like looking at like single sign-on across government services, I do think that intent from 5-6 years ago might start to be seen a bit more in the next few years. So I think that's super exciting because that opens up a whole different model of what government services are going to look like, and they can like cross organizational boundaries, so they can be organized by what the user's trying to do rather than like what the government department is necessarily called, and that kind of thing. It's but it's that technology hype curve, right? And so maybe these new technologies might be really useful, but maybe they're just in that kind of early stage.
We'll watch with interest. So reasons to be cheerful, reasons to be optimistic about the future of sort of government service design and delivery. So that's a good positive note on which probably to wrap things up. So all that remains for me to say is, Harry, thanks for joining us. Really enjoyed that conversation.
Me too. Thanks so much, Tim.
So there we have it. Thanks again to Harry for joining me for that exploration of the future of public sector delivery. Great news that you can also catch the conference session that we mentioned during the chat, which was part of the local Gov transformation show back in November. Citizen experience management was the topic, and as well as Harry sharing his expertise, we had public sector colleagues from Cornwall Council, Haringey and Norfolk County Council, public service delivery experts there sharing their best practice and ideas. So loads of value to drive from that. You can catch that session on demand. All you have to do is follow the link in the show notes accompanying this episode to enjoy that at your leisure. That's about it for now. We'll be back soon with another conversation with a public sector changemaker. But until then, goodbye.